Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Lafayette Bar murders. To understand the weight of this story, we must first travel back to the winter of 1986, to a city nestled at the joining of two rivers. Easton, Pennsylvania, is a place where history feels layered, like the sediment at the bottom of the Delaware. On the morning of December 17, a biting cold had settled over the Lehigh Valley. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and a thin, translucent crust of frost had glazed the cobblestones and the brick facades of the downtown district. It was a time of year when the world should have felt tucked away and festive, but in the early hours of that Wednesday, the silence hanging over North 4th Street was of a different quality. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind that precedes a storm or a shattering revelation. Standing at 15 North 4th Street was the Lafayette Bar, a cornerstone of the local community. It was more than just a place to grab a drink. It was a sanctuary of wood and warmth, where the smell of stale hops and well-worn leather had seeped into the very floorboards over decades. The bar was owned and operated by George Shore, a man of 77 years whose life was woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, and his wife, Judith, who was 47. Together, they curated a space that felt like an extension of their own living room. On this particular morning, the neon sign that usually hummed with a soft, comforting buzz was dark. The heavy wooden door, usually pushed open with a familiar creak by mid-morning, remained shut. To the casual observer walking toward the center square, everything seemed normal, save for the lack of activity. But for those who knew the Shores, the stillness was the first note of a discord that would soon amplify into a tragedy. The discovery began with a simple observation. A barmaid, arriving for her shift, noticed the lack of smoke from the chimney and the absence of the usual morning preparations. Her boots crunched on the frozen patches of sidewalk as she approached the side entrance. When she reached for the handle, she found it unlocked, a small detail that sent a prickle of unease down her spine. The interior of the bar was swallowed in shadows, the only light coming from the pale, gray winter sun filtering through the front windows. The air inside was stagnant, carrying the faint, metallic scent of something out of place. As she moved deeper into the room, the familiar sights of the bar, the rows of polished glasses, the tattered stools, the framed photographs on the walls, seemed distorted in the dim light. It was in this hush that she found them. George and Judith Shore, the hearts of the Lafayette, were gone, their lives extinguished in a manner so brutal it seemed impossible for such a peaceful place. The initial scene investigation was a slow, meticulous process carried out by officers who were themselves shaken by the identity of the victims. Every surface of the Lafayette Bar was examined under the harsh beam of flashlights. Investigators noted the lack of forced entry, suggesting that the killer might have been someone known to the couple, or perhaps someone who had slipped in just before closing the night before. The victims had been bludgeoned, the violence of the act contrasting sharply with the elderly George's gentle reputation. Blood had splattered across the dark wood of the bar, a grim map of a struggle that had occurred in the dead of night. Outside, the city of Easton began to wake up, unaware that its sense of security had been fractured. As the police tape was strung across the front of the building, fluttering in the icy wind, the rumors began to spread. The Shores were dead, and the breath of December had never felt so cold. By noon, the area surrounding the bar was a hive of somber activity. Neighbors stood on their porches, wrapping their coats tighter around their chests, watching as the coroner's van arrived. The confluence of the Lehigh and Delaware rivers continued its steady flow, indifferent to the lives lost just a few blocks away. For the people of Easton, the Lafayette Bar had been a constant, a place of routine and reliability. To see it transformed into a crime scene, with its windows shuttered and its owners being carried out in black bags, was a collective trauma. The investigation would eventually span years and cross state lines, But on that first day, there were only questions. Who could harbor such malice toward a 77-year-old man and his wife? What had happened in those final, dark hours of December 16? As the sun began to set early behind the hills, casting long, purple shadows over the city, the investigation was just beginning, and the mystery of the Lafayette Bar was only starting to reveal its jagged edges. The air hanging over 2nd Street was thick with the humid weight of late June, a stagnant warmth that seemed to trap the morning's grief against the damp pavement. Outside the Lafayette Bar and Grill, the world continued its slow, mechanical rotation, but inside the yellow tape, time had curdled into something unrecognizable. The investigators moved through the dim interior with a calculated, almost rhythmic precision, their shadows stretching long and thin across the scuffed linoleum floors. Every footstep echoed with a hollow thud, a stark contrast to the lively clink of glasses and the low hum of conversation that usually defined this corner of Easton. The smell of the nearby river, a mix of silt and ancient stones, drifted through the propped-open door, mingling unpleasantly with the metallic tang that now permeated the wood and upholstery. Detective notebooks were flipped open, their white pages glaringly bright under the flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects overhead. The bar itself, a solid and faithful fixture of the community, looked strangely diminished, its polished surface reflecting nothing but the grim faces of men searching for a reason where none seemed to exist. Among the first to be questioned were the regulars, the men and women who viewed the Lafayette not just as a tavern, but as a living room away from home. They stood in small, shivering clusters on the sidewalk, their hands shoved deep into their pockets despite the heat. One by one, they were led away from the growing crowd to speak with officers whose faces were etched with the exhaustion of a sleepless night. The interviews were slow, punctuated by long silences, where the only sound was the distant rumble of a passing truck or the soft scratching of a pen. They spoke of Misty, the bartender whose real name was Marcia, describing her as a woman of 29 years who possessed a laugh that could cut through the darkest of moods. They spoke of Butch, or George, a man of 45 who had simply been in the wrong place at the most terrible of times. The witnesses offered fragments of their night, but the fragments refused to form a picture. No one had seen a stranger lingering in the shadows of the alleyway. No one had heard the screech of tires or the heavy footfalls of a person in a hurry. The regulars looked at the ground, their eyes tracing the cracks in the concrete as they realized the person they had shared a drink with only hours ago was now a part of a tragedy they could not comprehend. As the sun climbed higher, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the brickwork of the surrounding buildings, the forensic team encountered a frustrating and eerie reality. There was a profound lack of physical evidence. They combed through the dust bunnies beneath the bar stools and sifted through the contents of the heavy glass ashtrays, looking for a single discarded cigarette or a stray hair that did not belong. But the scene was maddeningly clean. Most notably, there were no shell casings to be found anywhere within the premises. This absence spoke volumes to the seasoned investigators, suggesting the use of a revolver, a weapon that keeps its secrets tucked inside its metal cylinder. The lack of casings meant the killer had walked in, performed their dark task, and walked out without leaving behind the most basic signature of a shooting. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs or broken mirrors to suggest a fight for survival. The cash register sat undisturbed, its drawer holding the night's earnings in a mocking display of normalcy. Nothing had been stolen. No wallets were missing, and no jewelry had been pried from the victims. It was as if the violence had been an end in itself, a cold and calculated act that defied the typical logic of a robbery gone wrong. The search for a motive became a journey into a void. Detectives fanned out across the neighborhood, knocking on the weathered wooden doors of the apartments that lined 2nd Street. They spoke to elderly residents who had lived in Easton for 70 years, and to young couples who had only just moved in. Everyone described the same thing: a quiet night broken only by the muffled sounds of the city. The lack of a clear motive sent a shiver through the town that no summer breeze could dispel. If it wasn't money, what was it? The questions began to turn inward as neighbors looked at one another with newfound suspicion. They searched for grudges, for hidden debts, or for the kind of simmering anger that eventually boils over into blood. But Misty and Butch were well liked, their lives seemingly free of the kind of darkness that invites such an ending. The investigation felt like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Every lead seemed to dissipate the moment it was followed. The police checked the back alleys where the shadows lingered longest, peering behind rusted dumpsters and into the overgrown weeds of vacant lots, hoping to find a discarded weapon or a piece of clothing. They found only the discarded relics of everyday life: empty bottles, faded newspapers, and the persistent, heavy silence of a community that had suddenly realized its own fragility. By the late afternoon, the initial frantic energy of the crime scene had transitioned into a somber, grueling endurance. The yellow tape fluttered in a sudden, sharp gust of wind that smelled of impending rain. The investigators, their shirts stained with sweat and their eyes rimmed with red, began to pack away their kits. They had secured the scene, documented every inch of the floorboards, and gathered what few prints they could find. But the primary question remained unanswered. The shadows on 2nd Street seemed to grow deeper, pulling at the corners of the buildings as the light faded into a bruised purple. The Lafayette Bar stood as a silent witness, its windows dark and its doors locked tight for the first time in memory. Inside, the stagnant air held the echoes of 1,000 conversations, now buried under the weight of 1996's most enduring mystery. The town of Easton waited, suspended in a state of collective breath-holding, as the realization set in that the person responsible for such a quiet, efficient cruelty was still out there, walking the same streets and breathing the same humid air. The sense of security that had once draped over the neighborhood like a familiar quilt had been torn away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the unknown. The years following the tragedy at the Lafayette Bar did not bring the clarity the city of Easton so desperately craved. Instead, the 1980s bled into the 1990s like ink soaking into a damp paper, blurring the edges of memory and fact. By the time 1992 arrived, the bar at 500 Northampton Street had become a hollow shell, a brick-and-mortar ghost standing sentinel over a sidewalk that people began to cross just to avoid walking too close to its shadows. The vibrant, amber glow that once spilled from its windows into the evening air was gone, replaced by heavy plywood boards that grew gray and weathered under the assault of Pennsylvania winters. If you stood perfectly still on a quiet Tuesday night, you could almost hear the building sighing under the weight of its secrets. The air around the entrance felt different, thicker, colder, as if the atmosphere itself was trying to preserve the silence that had fallen over the basement stairs on that February night in 1980. The dust inside settled in thick, undisturbed layers over the mahogany bar top and the empty glass bottles, forming a soft, gray shroud over a world that had ended in an instant of inexplicable violence. Every year that passed without an arrest was another layer of that dust, another inch of distance between the living and the truth. In the local police archives, the file labeled Fashing and Bittner grew heavy, not with new evidence, but with the sheer gravity of time. By the middle of the 1990s, the detectives who had first stepped onto the blood-slicked floors of the Lafayette Bar were beginning to retire. They handed over their badges and their keys, but they could never quite hand over the burden of the unsolved case. The manila folders had turned a brittle, tea-stained yellow, and the edges of the crime scene photographs were starting to curl, the colors fading into a ghostly, muted palette. Younger officers would sometimes pull the boxes from the shelves during the slow, late-night shifts, their fingers tracing the typed names of George Fashing and Shirley Bittner. They would read the witness statements over and over, looking for a crack in the narrative, a single thread they could pull to unravel the mystery. But the trail had grown cold. Not just cold, but frozen, locked away in the collective amnesia of a city that wanted to move forward, but found its feet stuck in the mud of the past. The detectives would sit in the dim light of the precinct, the hum of the fluorescent bulbs the only sound in the room, and feel the presence of the two victims watching from the margins of the paperwork. The silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical pressure, a reminder that somewhere in the world, or perhaps just a few blocks away, a killer was breathing the same night air, watching the same moon rise over the Delaware River. For the families of George and Shirley, the 1990s were a decade of quiet, grueling endurance. The empty chairs at the Thanksgiving tables did not become easier to look at as the years moved from 1994 to 1996. Instead, the void they left behind seemed to expand, filling the rooms of their homes with a heavy, unspoken grief. Shirley's children were growing older, passing the milestones of their own lives while looking over their shoulders for a mother who should have been there to see them. George's friends would still catch themselves starting to tell a joke they knew he would love, only to be silenced by the sudden, sharp realization that he was gone. In the houses of Easton, the Lafayette Bar murders became a story told in low voices after the children were sent to bed. It was no longer just a news item. It had transformed into a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark. Parents would tell their teenagers to be careful, to watch their surroundings, their voices carrying an edge of genuine fear that had its roots in that unsolved February night. The community was bonded by a shared trauma, a collective wound that refused to scab over because the person who had inflicted it remained a shadow, a nameless specter who might be standing behind them in the grocery store line or sitting 3 pews down at Sunday service. The uncertainty was a poison that seeped into the very soil of the town, making every stranger a suspect and every dark alleyway a potential trap. The geography of Easton itself seemed to conspire with the silence. The Delaware and Lehigh rivers flowed perpetually past the city, their waters dark and churning, carrying the secrets of the valley out toward the sea. In the humid summer nights of the 1990s, the mist would rise off the river and crawl up the hills, swallowing the streetlights of Northampton Street and turning the downtown area into a labyrinth of gray stone and flickering shadows. The Lafayette Bar stood at the heart of this fog, its boarded windows looking like sightless eyes. People began to associate the very smell of the river, that damp, earthy scent of moss and ancient silt, with the mystery of the murders. It was as if the water knew what had happened in that basement, but lacked the voice to speak it. On the street corners, the local men would gather outside the remaining taverns, their cigarette embers glowing like tiny, angry stars in the twilight. They would talk about the old days, about how the city used to feel safer, and inevitably the conversation would drift back to George and Mitzi. They spoke of George's kindness and the way the bar had been a sanctuary for the weary. They spoke of the unfairness of it all, their words trailing off into the sound of the wind, rattling the signs above the shops. The 1990s were a long, slow exhale of a town that was holding its breath, waiting for a bell to toll, waiting for a name to finally be shouted into the silence. As 1999 approached, the turn of the millennium brought a strange mixture of hope and dread. The world was looking toward a new century, a fresh start, but for those connected to the Lafayette Bar, the ticking of the clock was a reminder of how much had been lost to the fog of time. 19 years had passed since the crime. In that time, babies had been born and grown into adulthood without ever knowing a world where the Lafayette Bar was a place of laughter. The investigation had moved from active to stagnant, and eventually to a state of suspended animation. The physical evidence, the hair samples, the stained clothing, the fingerprints lifted from the cold surfaces of the basement, sat in climate-controlled lockers, waiting for a technology that didn't yet exist to catch up with the brutality of the past. The killer, if they were still alive, had spent nearly 2 decades watching the seasons change, perhaps thinking they had truly gotten away with it. They had watched the 1980s vanish and the 1990s dissolve, leaning into the comfort of the long silence. But silence has a way of being deceptive. It can feel like an end, but often it is merely a pause, a deep, collective breath taken by the universe before the truth finally decides to claw its way back to the light. In the quiet streets of Easton, as the 1990s drew to a close, the memory of George and Shirley remained as sharp as a shard of broken glass, buried deep, but still capable of drawing blood. The year 2007 arrived with a quiet digital hum, a sharp contrast to the analog world where the shadows of the past still lingered. Inside the walls of the Macomb County precinct, the air was thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and the faint, metallic tang of cold coffee. It had been 17 years since the life of Barbara George was extinguished in the back room of a comic book shop. And for many, the case had become little more than a stack of yellowing paper and grainy, black-and-white photographs. But time is a curious thing. It does not erase the truth. It only buries it under layers of neglect. Cold case investigators, armed with fresh perspectives and a stubborn refusal to let the silence win, began to pull those files from their resting places. The drawers of the filing cabinets groaned, a heavy, sliding sound of metal on metal, as they were forced open, revealing the neatly tabbed folders that held the secrets of 1990. Outside, the Michigan wind rattled the window panes, a restless spirit looking for a way in, while inside, the detectives began the slow, painstaking process of shaking off the dust. The investigators sat beneath the flicker of fluorescent lights that hummed with a low, hypnotic frequency. Their fingers, slightly calloused at the tips, traced the edges of witness statements that had not been read in nearly 2 decades. They were looking for the new light, that sudden, piercing clarity that occurs when a story is told too many times and the cracks finally begin to show. They focused their gaze on Michael George. By 2007, he had long since moved away from the echoes of the shop in Clinton Township. He had carved out a new life in Pennsylvania, marrying the woman who had once been his employee and, as many suspected, his mistress. To the world, he was a man who had moved on, but to the detectives, he was a man whose past was catching up with him. They looked at the old grievances, the small, petty resentments that had been documented but dismissed in the initial chaos of the investigation. There were reports of his unhappiness, his complaints about his wife's appearance after the birth of their children, and his growing frustration with the mundane reality of their shared life. These weren't just details. They were the tectonic plates of a motive, shifting slowly beneath the surface. As the investigators re-interviewed those who had been close to the couple, the atmosphere of the room seemed to shift. They listened to the voices of family members and friends, now older and perhaps more willing to speak the truths they had previously whispered. One witness recalled the chilling sight of Michael at the hospital shortly after the murder. Not a man broken by grief, but a man who seemed to exhale a sigh of profound relief, as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. Others spoke of the funeral, where he stood behind dark sunglasses, his cheeks dry, his demeanor aloof. He had even been seen flirting with a woman at the very wake of his wife. These sensory memories, preserved for 17 years, began to paint a picture of a man who was already living in a future where Barbara did not exist. The detectives felt the weight of these accounts, the way they pressed against the air in the small interview rooms. The texture of the case was changing. It was no longer a mystery of who, but a slow, methodical unveiling of why. The most significant breakthrough came from a single, overlooked tip sheet that had slipped between the folders like a secret waiting to be found. It was a record of a phone call from a man named Michael Renaud, a regular customer of the shop. He claimed that on the evening of the murder, he had called the store and spoken directly to Michael George. This was a direct contradiction to Michael's alibi, his claim that he had been miles away, sleeping soundly on his mother's couch. The realization hit the detectives with the force of a physical blow. The silence of the room was suddenly broken by the scratching of pens on legal pads as they mapped out the timeline. If he was at the store, he was within reach of the weapon. If he was at the store, the story of the random robbery began to crumble like dry parchment. They imagined the shop as it was then, the smell of old paper and ink, the dim lighting, and the solitary figure of a man who thought he had outsmarted time itself. The dust was moving now, swirling in the new light of 2007, revealing the path that led directly back to the husband. Every detail was scrutinized with a magnifying glass of modern suspicion. The investigators looked at the insurance policies, $130,000, a sum that would have felt like a fortune to a man drowning in gambling debts and the upkeep of a struggling business. They thought about the safe in the back room, which showed no signs of forced entry, its heavy door standing slightly ajar as if it had been opened by a familiar hand. They considered the missing comic books, high-value items that Michael claimed were stolen, only for one of them to later surface in the hands of a customer who had purchased it before the crime ever took place. The lies were like fine threads, easily broken when pulled individually, but when woven together, they formed a net that was slowly tightening around Michael George. The investigators worked late into the night, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of a clock and the soft rustle of paper. They were no longer just looking at a cold case. They were watching a ghost take shape, a figure emerging from the fog of nearly 2 decades of deception. By the time the sun began to rise over the frosted Michigan landscape, the decision was clear. The statements had been re-examined, the grievances had been quantified, and the witness accounts had been verified against the cold, hard facts of the timeline. The investigators felt a sense of somber purpose. They knew that the arrest would not bring Barbara back, but it would finally answer the questions that had haunted the community for 17 years. The new light had done its work, illuminating the dark corners of a marriage that had turned deadly. Michael George, far away in Pennsylvania, likely thought he was safe, protected by the distance and the years. But the law is a patient hunter. As the detectives prepared their warrants, the air in the precinct felt lighter, as if the very walls were exhaling. The truth was no longer buried. It was standing in the center of the room, stark and undeniable. The investigation into the Lafayette Bar murders had found its target, and the long road to justice was finally reaching its end. The heavy, brass-handled doors of the Northampton County Courthouse swung open in the year 2011, admitting a chilly draft that seemed to carry the scent of rain and wet stone from the streets of Easton. Inside, the courtroom was a sanctuary of polished oak and hushed, expectant voices, where the air felt thick with the gravity of 3 decades of unanswered questions. The light, filtered through tall, narrow windows, cast long, amber rectangles across the floor, illuminating the tiny motes of dust that danced in the stillness. It was a space where time seemed to fold back on itself, bringing the ghosts of 1980 into the sharp, clinical reality of the new millennium. As the spectators took their seats, the rhythmic creak of the wooden benches provided a somber soundtrack to the proceedings. There was no rush here, only the slow, deliberate pulse of the law, preparing to dissect a tragedy that had been frozen in the memories of a community for 31 years. At the prosecution's table, the air was heavy with the weight of thick, cardboard evidence boxes, their edges softened by years of storage in climate-controlled basements. The lead prosecutor adjusted his glasses, his fingers brushing against a stack of grainy, black-and-white photographs that depicted the Lafayette Bar as it was on that final, frozen night in February. He began his narrative not with a shout, but with a whisper, painting a picture of a Tuesday evening where the smell of stale beer and tobacco smoke had been suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of blood. He spoke of Robert and Richie Snavely, the husband and wife who had poured their lives into that wood-paneled tavern, only to have those lives extinguished in a flurry of violence. The prosecution's voice was steady, a low hum that filled the room, describing the way the neon sign outside must have flickered, casting a rhythmic red glow over the chaos inside, while the rest of the world slept in ignorant peace. Across the aisle sat William Wright, the man known to many by the rugged moniker of Wild Bill. He remained remarkably still, his weathered face a mask of stoic indifference as the details of the crime washed over him. His defense attorney stood slowly, the fabric of his dark suit whispering against the chair. The defense's opening was centered not on the events themselves, but on the ethereal, treacherous nature of time. He invited the jury to consider the year 1980, a world before the digital age, a world where memories were captured on film and stored in shoeboxes. He argued that 31 years was not just a gap, but a canyon, one that swallowed the fine details of a human face, the exact cadence of a voice, and the sequence of a few terrifying seconds. He spoke of the fog of history, suggesting that the prosecution was asking the jury to look through a glass so clouded by decades of dust that the truth was no longer visible. Only a shape that they were being told was a monster. As the first witnesses were called to the stand, the courtroom became a theater of fragile recollection. Elderly men and women, who had been young and vibrant on that winter night, walked with careful, measured steps to the witness box. Their hands, some trembling with age or nerves, rested on the cool surface of the wood. One by one, they were asked to reach back into the recesses of their minds, to pull forward the sights and sounds of the Lafayette Bar. They described the texture of the bar stools, the sound of the jukebox as it clicked between records, and the sudden, jarring interruption of the gunshots. But under the sharp questioning of the defense, the certainty in their voices occasionally wavered. How could they be sure of a shadow they saw 3 decades ago? Was the man they remembered really the man sitting before them? Or was he a composite of rumors and newspaper clippings they had read over a lifetime? The silence between the questions and the answers was long and heavy, filled only by the distant hum of the building's ventilation system and the soft scratching of the court reporter's pen. The prosecution countered this narrative of decay by introducing new forensic perspectives, the silent witnesses that do not forget. They brought forth the modern analysis of old lead, the re-examination of shell casings that had sat in paper envelopes for more than 10,000 days. They spoke of a cold case unit that had meticulously re-interviewed everyone, finding threads of consistency that the defense called coincidental. The tension in the room was palpable, a physical sensation like the static before a summer storm. Each piece of evidence was handled with a reverence usually reserved for religious relics, passed from hand to gloved hand under the watchful eyes of the judge. The narrative of the legal battle was one of endurance versus erosion. Could the truth survive the relentless march of the seasons? Or would the passage of 31 years prove to be the ultimate shield for a secret kept in the dark? The shadows in the courtroom grew longer as the sun began to dip behind the buildings of Easton, leaving the jury to ponder the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The gavel fell with a heavy, final thud in 1982, sounding like the closing of a heavy iron door. At that moment, the people of Easton believed they could finally exhale. Charles Gantz was led away, convicted of the 2 lives stolen from the Lafayette Bar. For a time, the dust seemed to settle. The community looked at the red bricks of North 4th Street and felt the chill of that July night begin to lift. But justice is a fragile thing, often built on the shifting sands of testimony and the hidden motives of those who stand in the witness box. Behind the scenes, the foundation of the prosecution's case was already beginning to crumble, hidden beneath the weight of secrets that the law requires to be brought into the light. The closure everyone felt was merely a temporary ceasefire in a long, quiet war for the truth. Years drifted by like smoke, and the 1980s wore on. The case moved from the vibrant, bustling streets of Easton to the sterile, quiet halls of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. In 1986, the legal world was rocked by a decision that would reopen every old wound. The conviction of Charles Gance was overturned. The High Court looked at the records and found a shadow where there should have been clarity. It was revealed that the prosecution had failed to disclose a crucial detail about a key witness. There had been a deal, a promise of leniency, a whisper of a reduced sentence in exchange for the testimony that had sent Gance to prison. This failure to reveal the agreement meant that the scales of justice had been tilted from the very start. The dust, which had once seemed so still, was suddenly kicked up into a blinding cloud once again. A second trial followed, but the atmosphere was different now. The witnesses were older, their memories worn thin like weathered parchment. The forensic evidence, once presented with such certainty, now faced the scrutiny of a new era. In the end, the jury returned a verdict that left the city in a state of stunned silence. Charles Gance was found not guilty. He walked out of the courthouse and into the afternoon sun, a free man. But for the families of George and Judith Bonish, there was no freedom. There was only a return to the unknown. The legal system had circled back to the beginning, leaving the murders of two beloved citizens as a mystery without a name. The streets of Easton felt a little colder that day, as if the shadows in the doorways had grown just a few inches longer. We often talk of cases being cold, but for those who knew George and Judy, the memory remains warm and vivid. George was a man of the neighborhood, a presence behind the bar that felt as permanent as the building itself. Judy was his partner in every sense, the heart that kept the Lafayette Bar beating through long nights and quiet afternoons. They were not just names on a police report. They were the laughter over a shared drink, the comfort of a familiar face, and the dream of a quiet retirement that was never allowed to happen. When you walk past 15 North 4th Street today, you can almost hear the phantom clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversation that once filled the room. The bar still stands, a landmark of history, but the air inside carries the weight of everything that was lost on that humid night in 1980. The Lafayette Bar murders remain one of Easton's most enduring enigmas. It is a story of a robbery gone wrong, of a legal system that stumbled, and of a community that was forced to learn how to live with an unanswered question. The case files are tucked away now, the edges of the photographs curling with age, the ink on the statements fading into a soft gray. Every few years, someone mentions a new lead or a different theory, but the truth remains just out of reach, hidden in the corners of the past where no one thinks to look anymore. It is a reminder that some stories do not have a tidy ending. Some stories simply fade into the rhythm of the city, becoming part of the architecture, part of the wind that whistles through the valley on a winter night. As the moon hangs high over the Delaware River, the lights of Easton begin to flicker out one by one. The red brick buildings hold their secrets tight, and the river flows on, indifferent to the dramas played out on its banks. We leave George and Judy now, resting in the quiet memory of those who loved them. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.